The summer of 1935 was quiet in the Atlantic. So far, the hurricane season only saw one hurricane, a Category 4 that mostly stayed out to sea. But hurricane forecasting was primitive, with no satellites and no radar. The only way you knew a hurricane was out there, somewhere, was if a ship encountered it and reported it back. And only with those sparse ship reports, hurricanes could appear almost out of nowhere. Hurricane season was scary in the tropics before satellites came around in the 1960s. Little to no warning about a hurricane in the morning, which could be on your doorstep by afternoon. And in the case of 1935, this was just another average hurricane season in the Atlantic, and with no ships reporting any disturbances on the horizon, why would forecasters be worried? It would be only a few days from now that the most powerful and violent hurricane to ever strike American soil would hit, and yet, nobody has even the slightest clue of what is about to happen. I'm Michael Ferragamo, and today we're looking back 90 years as of this very recording of the 1935 Labor Day hurricane. And I tell you what, you will see some of the most intense damage that has ever been observed from an Atlantic hurricane. In late August 1935, a tropical wave rolled off Africa. This was nothing unusual, as these areas of disturbed weather come off Africa every hurricane season. However, due to lack of technology and ship reports, this tropical wave was hardly noticed, and for days the system drifted west towards the Caribbean. It wasn't until 2 a.m. on August 29th that this tropical wave that emerged off Africa several days ago had become a little more organized and strengthened into a tropical depression. At this time, early on August 29th, the Weather Bureau still really had no idea that this storm even existed, even though, nowadays it doesn't seem crazy. It was only 100 or so miles east of the Bahamas. And that would really be the case, this unknowingness, for the next few days as the storm continued to intensify and move to the west. You'll soon see how kind of this lack of preparation, this lack of data and technology really contributes to one of the worst hurricanes in American history. By the next day, at 8 p.m. on August 30th, the tropical depression strengthened into a tropical storm while located 150 miles northeast of the Turks and Caicos. In today's modern day, this tropical storm would have received a name. However, prior to 1950, hurricanes were not named and instead given numbers in which it formed. For example, this storm was the third system of the hurricane season, thus it would be classified as Tropical Storm 3, and so on for the other storms that form. It wouldn't be until the next day, on August 31st, that the Weather Bureau got word of the storm's existence, but at this point, the fate of the Florida Keys was already sealed. At 8 a.m. the following morning, a ship reported stormy conditions just south of Andros Island. This was the first time a vessel had reported anything on the storm. This report, paired with observations on Andros Island, indicated the sure existence of a hurricane located about 10 miles south of the island. So this is great news, right? A ship has confirmed the presence of a hurricane. The Weather Bureau now roughly knows where it is, how strong it is and which way it's going. This is all great. But, over the next day, even the most experienced forecasters of the time could not have imagined what this storm was about to do. As the storm continued moving west, its environment was perfect. The waters of the Florida Straits were bathtub warm, and wind shear, something that helps tear apart hurricanes, was non-existent. The storm was about to undergo one of the most incredible rapid intensification phases ever observed in the Atlantic Ocean. 12 hours later, at 8 p.m., it strengthened into a Category 2 hurricane with winds of 105 miles per hour. It's at this point that what you are about to witness is something only seen amongst the upper echelons of Atlantic hurricanes. We need to discuss a topic called rapid intensification. This occurs when a hurricane's maximum sustained winds increase by 35 miles per hour in 24 hours. This is not uncommon in the Atlantic, as numerous storms have been documented to achieve and exceed such a feat. However, only a handful of systems have ever achieved such intensification like you're about to see. As night fell, the hurricane exploded. By the next morning, it had explosively intensified into a Category 4 hurricane with winds of 140 miles per hour. This was now a monster major hurricane as it began to turn northwest towards Florida. Earlier that morning, the 3:30 a.m. advisory predicted the disturbance will probably pass through the Florida Straits Monday, and cautioned high tides and gales along the Florida Keys. The Weather Bureau at this time still had no idea just how strong the storm really was, and all the while, its central pressure continued to fall through the floor, but this monster wasn't done yet. During the afternoon of the 2nd, while the hurricane was exploding in intensity north of Cuba, the first recorded instance of an aircraft flown for the specific purpose of locating a hurricane was occurring. The Weather Bureau's 1:30 p.m. advisory placed the center of the hurricane at 23.5 degrees north, 80 degrees west, moving slowly westward. This was about 30 miles north of the Cuban mainland and 145 miles east of Havana. Captain Leonard Pavy of the Aviation Corps of the Cuban Army volunteered to investigate the threat. Flying a Curtiss F-6 Hawk, Captain Pavy observed the storm north of its reported position. Because he was flying an open cockpit biplane, he opted not to fly into the storm, but found the hurricane was north of what the Weather Bureau thought. By 8 p.m. on September 2, 1935, the hurricane strengthened into a Category 5 with winds of 185 miles per hour. In the hurricane database today, going back to 1851, this intensity would rank it among the strongest Atlantic hurricanes on record. The Weather Bureau had no idea the storm was this powerful, but it didn't matter. It was too late. The catastrophe was now just hours away. The Weather Bureau's Miami office issued bulletins warning of a modest hurricane in the Florida Keys, with heavy seas. This language was not dire enough. There was no mention of catastrophic surge or wind arriving in just mere hours, partly because they didn't know how strong the storm was, and partly because hurricane forecasting language in 1935 avoided dramatic wording to prevent public panic, a tactic often used in history. The hurricane's pressure continued to plunge and soon fell below 900 millibars, as of 2025, a feat only achieved by 5 other Atlantic hurricanes. It was now 9 p.m., just about 1 hour away from landfall, and residents along the Florida Keys had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. At this time, the hurricane was extremely compact in size, its eye estimated to be only 10 to 15 miles wide, with its maximum sustained winds extending a mere 6 miles from its center. This extremely small eye, likely smaller than 1992's Hurricane Andrew, is a sign of an extremely intense hurricane. These small eyes are called pinhole eyes, and they are seen only in the most intense of Atlantic hurricanes. A small eye means low pressure in the center is packed into a very small area. The pressure gradient force, or the change in pressure over a distance, is much steeper, which drives much stronger winds near the center. The eye wall is extremely close to that center, so the rising air and intense convection also feed directly into the core. This compact heat engine is very efficient at converting ocean heat into wind energy. So when you have an 185 mile per hour Category 5 monster with an extremely tight core, whatever landmass that core tracks over, it's over. It is utter devastation. And for the Florida Keys at this point, the fate was sealed. It's pretty much over. You're either lucky enough that you're not in that 15-mile wide radius, or you are dying. So I want to recall our definition of rapid intensification from earlier and how it's defined by a 35 mile per hour increase in a storm's maximum sustained winds in 24 hours. Well, this hurricane not only did that, but it strengthened 80 miles per hour in 24 hours, going from a 105 mile per hour Category 2 to a 185 mile per hour Category 5. Over double the definition of rapid intensification. Upper echelon of Atlantic hurricanes right here. Absolutely incredible. Due to the Weather Bureau's bulletin earlier in the day, some residents knew of the impending storm. However, many assumed it would be just like the storms they've ridden out here before. Unfortunately, the true scale of the hurricane had not been adequately conveyed to those on the Keys, simply because the Weather Bureau itself was clueless on how strong the hurricane was. Tonight was the night the Keys would be obliterated. This extremely tight core led to a very sharp increase in the winds along the Florida Keys, as the storm was about to make landfall. As the hurricane approached and was only a few miles from the Keys, the storm's radius of maximum sustained winds finally reached the Keys, and after that, it was utter devastation. No adequate shelter, no escape, and as you'll see in a minute, wind was not the only threat. A few minutes before 9 p.m., the wall of wind slammed into the Keys. Sustained winds of 185 miles per hour altered the landscape. A constant, deafening roar described like 1,000 locomotives. Palm trees, once towering along the shore, snapped like matchsticks. Entire houses didn't just fall, they disintegrated. Long Key brunt the worst of the storm at first. The Long Key fishing camp itself, once a playground for the rich and famous, was obliterated. Solid wooden lodges and cabins were shredded into fragments, their debris carried away. In a matter of minutes, one of the Key's greatest resorts was gone, leaving only bare ground and twisted debris. Farther northeast, along Matecumbe Key, a tragedy was about to unfold. Within minutes, the wall of wind reached Upper Matecumbe Key, the area where hundreds of veterans were sheltered. The veterans' work camps, long wooden barracks, came apart within minutes, leaving hundreds of men suddenly exposed to the storm. The Veterans Administration requested a train from Miami to move them to safety, but delays resulted in the train arriving too late. By the time the train reached Isla Morada around 9 p.m., winds of 185 miles per hour derailed the train. The wooden barracks where most veterans lived simply disintegrated, the debris swept cleanly away. Of the 600 veterans stationed in the Keys before the hurricane, more than 250 were killed. At this point at 9 p.m., the winds were so violent that stepping outside was certain death. Telephone poles were torn out of the ground, and the Overseas Railroad, a crucial artery of the Keys, twisted under the 185-mile-per-hour winds. People blown off their feet, hurled into the darkness, with some survivors recalling those along the beach being sandblasted to death. It was clear this was not the average hurricane anymore. This was something completely different that had never been recorded before. The pressure continued to plummet along the Keys as the wind made the landscape unrecognizable. Suddenly, after 1 to 2 hours of unimaginable destruction, the winds eased as the tiny, 8-mile-wide eye moved directly overhead. Those who survived the eye wall first thought the storm had passed. They pushed open doors, crawled from beneath collapsed debris, and climbed into the open air. What they found was perhaps the most unbelievable sight to ever be seen in a hurricane. As survivors looked up into the sky, the moon shone and stars glimmered, framed by walls of clouds rising like cliffs on all sides. Survivors likely saw what is called the stadium effect. This effect is only seen in the most powerful of hurricanes, where the eye wall completely surrounds the clear, pristine eye, which is visible from the ground. So imagine you're standing on the ground and you come out of your shelter and you look up and you see you're in a bowl, right? Like you're in a stadium looking up and you just see the stands and the wall all above you and to the side of you. There's no words to describe it. Very few people have experienced this and documented this. And unfortunately, when you have scenes like this, as cool as it is, it's often accompanied by some insane devastation. As otherworldly as the sky looked to the survivors, the moonlight revealed much more tragedy. An island stripped bare, palms lay in jagged piles, buildings swept clean away, and the railroad twisted like ribbon. The air was heavy and unnervingly still, so still that survivors could hear the crash of waves far out on the reef. For many, it was their first glimpse of what the storm had done. Accounts from survivors say the eye of the storm was bright, clear, and deceptively peaceful, but filled with devastation. Some even described it as otherworldly, like standing in the middle of an open-air amphitheater with cloud walls rising around them. Many survivors also recalled their ears popping during the calm. This is because the storm had an unbelievably low pressure of 892 millibars recorded on Craig Key. This pressure alone makes this the most intense landfalling hurricane recorded anywhere in the Western Hemisphere to this day, as well as the third most intense Atlantic hurricane on record. But the calm of the storm was short-lived, only about 40 minutes in duration over Matecumbe Key and 55 minutes over Long Key. But towards the end of the calm eye, the nail in the coffin would arrive. Even though the tiny hurricane center crossed Long Key, it sent the worst storm surge to the north towards Matecumbe Key. And at 10 p.m., the surge arrived with the backside of the eye wall close behind. The surge, estimated to be 15 to 20 feet high, demolished every remaining structure on the island. Rails, roads, and ferries that all chain the islands together were stripped clean. Any remaining barracks that housed veterans were leveled and swept cleanly away, with people either being killed by debris or swept away by the surge. So as if things weren't already bad enough on the Florida Keys, the backside of the eye wall was starting to close in on these islands. So, to say the very least, right, cut to the chase, the next round of 185-mile-per-hour winds is going to absolutely level everything, or I should say anything, that is still standing. By 10:15 p.m., the western eye wall of the hurricane closed in, and the 185-mile-per-hour winds returned from the opposite direction. The storm surge continued to rise, approaching nearly 20 feet high, swallowing most of the islands entirely. In some places, the entire width of the Keys was underwater. People clung desperately to rooftops and trees, many were swept away into the darkness. The force of the surge was so powerful that parts of the Overseas Railroad, the proud achievement of Henry Flagler, was twisted, mangled, and swept away entirely. Bridges disintegrated, and train cars were ripped from their tracks. The line, once called the railroad that went to sea, would never run again. The relentless wind and surge would go on for the next few hours until it finally began to calm down. But as you could imagine, for some of these people the rare few who did survive the eye wall, the storm surge, and then the eye wall again, it must have felt like absolute days before the storm calmed. By the time the hurricane passed around 1 a.m. on September 3rd, the middle portion of the Florida Keys were unrecognizable. It wasn't until daybreak that survivors and rescuers saw the work of a 185 mile per hour Category 5 monster. Survivors said it was as if the islands had been bombed into oblivion, with another saying it's a miracle anybody survived. Unfortunately, more people died than survived that night, with at least 408 losing their lives, most of them with no chance of escape. The strongest hurricane ever to strike the United States had left its mark. At the time of the hurricane, nobody knew the exact strength, and it wasn't until a modern-day reanalysis that researchers found out. Taking the recorded pressure of 892 millibars from the tiny core and pairing that with the hurricane's forward speed of about 8 miles per hour, which we know from the eye's duration over the Keys, gave researchers a value of roughly 160 knots or 185 miles per hour. This value ranks the 1935 Labor Day hurricane as the strongest landfalling Atlantic hurricane on record, tied with Hurricane Dorian in 2019. The incredibly low pressure of 892 millibars also makes the storm the most intense landfalling hurricane ever observed in the Western Hemisphere and puts the storm third as the most intense Atlantic hurricane on record. On Long and Matacumbe Key, nearly every building was obliterated. Rail tracks were twisted like toys, bridges torn from their foundations, and entire train cars missing. The Florida Keys were left shattered, but among the most heartbreaking losses were the hundreds of World War I veterans sent to the Keys as part of work relief camps. Many drowned when their flimsy barracks were obliterated and swept away. Relief efforts were slow and grim. With roads impassable and communication lines destroyed, survivors were left stranded for days. Mass cremations were ordered to prevent disease as bodies lay entangled in mangrove branches and scattered along the shorelines. In fact, the hurricane was so violent that bodies were found 50 miles north near the Everglades. For a small island chain connected to the U.S. mainland, this was nothing short of catastrophic. But the hurricane's devastation reached far beyond the Florida Keys, and the power reshaped disaster response, it exposed flaws in relief systems, and it sparked some heavy national outrage. The human toll, particularly among the World War I veterans, ignited a firestorm of outrage across the country. The veterans were living in flimsy work relief camps on the low-lying islands, tasked with building the overseas highway. As the storm approached, warnings came too late. Despite the imminent danger, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration failed to evacuate them in time. A rescue train was dispatched, but delays proved fatal. And by the time help arrived, hundreds of lives had already been lost, many swept away in the storm surge. The nation recoiled in shock. How could this have happened to men who had already sacrificed so much for their country? The media coverage was immediate and scathing. Writers like Ernest Hemingway condemned the government's negligence, highlighting the systemic failures and stark inequalities that turned a natural disaster into a human catastrophe. Public outrage surged, demanding accountability. President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered a federal investigation, but the initial findings were met with skepticism. Many accused the report of a whitewash, and decades would pass before the full extent of the negligence was acknowledged. Yet from this tragedy came lasting change. Hurricane warning systems were improved, forecast methods refined, and federal disaster response protocols strengthened. The 1935 Labor Day hurricane stands as a haunting reminder that nature doesn't really care if you're rich or poor, if you're a veteran or not. It's indiscriminate, but human error can make it a lot more deadly, and the nation's outrage was a call for justice to ensure that what happened during the 35 hurricane would never happen again. Today, nearly a century has passed since the 1935 Labor Day hurricane, yet its memory remains etched into the islands and into the nation's collective consciousness. Across the Keys, monuments stand in solemn tribute to the men who lost their lives. including one standing tall just east of US 1 at mile marker 82 in Isla Mirada, unveiled in November 1937. The 1935 Labor Day hurricane is the benchmark of all US landfalling hurricanes. Its rapid intensification to its extremely rare and catastrophic landfall, all monsters that threaten land are instantly compared to this storm. From solemn monuments to digital archives, this hurricane serves as both a cautionary tale and a testament to resilience, a reminder of the lives lost, the lessons learned, and the collective memory that keeps their stories alive. But one thing is for sure, living in the tropics before the satellite era must have been absolutely terrifying. You wouldn't know if you had a monster category 5 on your doorstep, 2 days out, 1 day out, even 5 hours out. You would have absolutely no idea that your life could change forever in just a matter of hours. I'm Michael Ferragamo, and I'll see you next time.